we have an important story to tell if we're going to get the full amount of value out of the book of Galatians. And I didn't want to assume on the story, and I wanted to give the story enough weight and value, so it seemed appropriate to tell the story in its own separate spot. And here's what we're going to do. In order to understand Galatians, we have to understand the story of Abraham and how he is the father of all those who believe. It's one thing for us to start talking about the importance and the value of faith, but the other thing that the scriptures do is the scriptures make sure that we have an idea of the opposite of faith, which is actually works. Obviously there's unbelief, but the real enemy of faith is works in place of faith. So we need to talk about how Abraham is the father of all those who believe without works. So a long time ago, 2000 BC roughly, very few people worshipped the one true God. We know of Melchizedek, but very few people understood that there was a one true God and worshipped him. God showed himself to a fairly young man named Abraham and made three promises in Genesis 12. I will give you a plot of land, and it will be yours and your children's forever. I will give you so many kids, they'll be more than the stars of the sky to count. And through them is going to come a great blessing to all the nations. So in the story, Abraham believes God and sets out from his homeland and follows him to the land that God shows him and ends up in modern-day Palestine, the nation of Israel, and also believes God sort of about the children thing. He was married to Sarah, who could not have kids, and then there's the story of him having a child through her maidservant, and that becomes a story in Galatians 4. But that was not the source of God's blessing. God waited until both of their bodies were beyond childbearing years, and then God gave them the miracle child of Isaac. So then through Isaac came one child, Jacob, who received the blessing, Jacob and Esau. Through Jacob came the blessing that multiplied all of the people that we know of as Israel. Abraham never saw the blessing that was promised. He saw the land, he saw the first child, the seed, but he never saw the blessing that was promised. But in that, God said, if you believe me about what I'm going to do for you, I will do it. And it says in Genesis 15 that Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So God made a deal with him. Since you believe me, I want you to remove the flesh of your foreskin. And they became circumcised as a sign of being part of this promise. Here, the removal of the flesh, which we're going to read about a lot in Galatians. So some years go by, Abraham passes away, many kids are had. All they really have is the story of Abraham and the promise, and they generally believe, but they don't really have any prominent interaction with God. So about 400 years or so later, through Moses, God rescues the children of Abraham from slavery in Egypt and makes another covenant with them, a different covenant with them based around the Ten Commandments and a system of blood sacrifices. So if they obeyed the commandments, not just the Ten Commandments, but everything surrounding it, and walked in the system of blood sacrifices, animal sacrifices, that they would have a measure of life in them. If they were circumcised, they would be in the covenant, and then they would be blessed. But they had to obey, or there would not be the life that was offered. So the Jewish people had a wild ride for the rest of the biblical history from around the year 1400 of alternately obeying and disobeying God, walking in the covenant, not walking in the covenant. And they were expecting to be recipients of a promise, and then they were expecting to be the carriers of this promise. And so they maintained circumcision of their flesh, and then alternately obeyed or disobeyed the various laws and covenants that they had made with God. But then when Christ came, he, apart from everything that he said and did and demonstrated, he died like a lamb, one of their blood sacrifices. Then he rose again like a deity and immediately started blessing everyone with the same spirit that he had, whether or not they were in the covenant that Moses had established. Whether or not people were circumcised, whether or not people knew about the Ten Commandments, whether or not they were in the physical lineage to Abraham, suddenly people are getting this blessed spirit, whether or not they were Jewish, direct descendants of Abraham. And it became a real sticking point. People became really upset. People who had worked hard their whole life at being obedient were essentially jealous that God would share his spirit with people who had not participated in the covenant of Moses. And it was very shocking. And what they had misunderstood, and what we're going to see in Galatians 3, what they had misunderstood was that the promise that God made to Abraham was not to seeds, as in the promise was supposed to go to all of Israel, and that all of Israel was going to be the blessing to the world. No, the promise was to seed, singular. And Jesus Christ, being of the birth line to Abraham, was that seed. God poured out the blessing that he promised, Galatians 3:14 and past, into Jesus. So now through Jesus, the singular seed, all the blessing that God wanted to pour out comes through Jesus. And so you take part in the blessing that comes through Jesus by faith, because that was what God told Abraham. God told Abraham that through his seed would come the blessing, and Abraham's belief allowed it to be so. So then, God then blesses all the believing people with that spirit, whether or not they took part in any of the Jewish customs of circumcision or any of the laws, the Ten Commandments. And so the Spirit then was the fulfillment for humanity about being righteous. People no longer could be righteous just by obeying the Ten Commandments. Now they were going to be righteous and holy simply by believing that the Spirit of Jesus lived inside of them. How the religious people hated that. But the reason we know about it today is because it wasn't just the religious people that this message offended, but it's all humanity that believe that our works should count for something in God's eyes. That is to say that our works should have some sort of value to God in having approval or being declared in some extra tier of awesomeness or privilege with him. And it was indeed the privilege that the Jews were expecting, to be the privileged people that this blessing would proceed from. But God just went right around Moses and blessed people who had faith like Abraham. So, the blessing that God promised Abraham was the Spirit, and the Spirit only comes to those who believe. God isn't looking for works to bless, he's looking for faith, and he still does so today.